first speaker this morning is Dr. Tony Tatman. He received his master's in marriage and family therapy from the University of Wisconsin-Stout and his PhD in counseling psychology from Western Michigan University. He's been providing therapy and conducting assessment on sexual offenders since 2005 and has testified as an expert witness on sex offender evaluations and treatment. Dr. Tatman currently works with the Iowa Department of Correctional Services, 5th Judicial District as their clinical director and past supervisor for their sex offender treatment program. He's on the board and past chair for the Iowa Board for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. He is also currently on the board of directors for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Iowa, and the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Abuse. Please help me welcome Dr. Tony Tatman.
Thank you for the introduction. First name is Tony Tatman. Hope I didn't write that wrong for the bio. Thank you for inviting me here. I'd like to also introduce one of my co-presenters, Christine King, over here. Christine King is a probation officer with the Department of Correctional Services, 5th District. For those who may not know, the state of Iowa is broken up into 8 different judicial districts. 5th District is Polk County on up to about Ames, 4 counties wide, all the way down to the Missouri border. So that is the 5th Judicial District where we're coming from. And Christine King is one of our probation parole officers who specializes in sex offender work as well as the reentry piece. And so any questions that you might have about transferring an offender from, let's say, an institution, prison, let's say, for example, to a facility in your neighborhood, she would be the person to direct questions to. So I'd hand over the mic for Christine and questions like that. I've been asked to do a pretty tough thing today and talk to you about sex offender evaluations, sex offender risk, and how it relates to care facilities. That's a pretty big task. We could spend a lot of time on just one of those pieces. For example, sex offender evaluations. Sex offender evaluations are quite complicated. And the message that we would like for you to take home with, if anything, is that a sex offender is not a sex offender is not a sex offender. That the media has painted, unfortunately just recently, a very negative picture, maybe rightly so, of the sex offender who was involved in that crime up north, Mr. Klunder. And so that is what's on everybody's mind as the picture of a sex offender. Although that is correct in some situations, that is the minority of the population who make sex offenses. There is kind of a bell curve type of a look for sex offenders, with majority being moderate to lower risk offenders. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, what I mean by that. With the minority being those high risk, psychopathic, antisocial offenders, possibly like what happened just recently. So that's a take-home message we would like to have you leave with, is if sex offender is not a sex offender is not a sex offender. And some may be quite appropriate for a care facility such as where you're coming from. And so what I'm hoping to do is to be able to give you enough information that you can leave here with enough information to ask good questions on who can come to our facility. I heard there might be some legislators in the room, or I guess on stream, but they can't chime in. Any legislators in the room right now? Okay, great, wonderful, glad to have you. Care facility staff, I mean, I'm sure the rest is care facility staff. Okay, all right. Feel free to make this as informal as we can. That to make this valuable for you all, it really should be a two-way street of asking questions to make this valuable for you. I could come up here and talk all day about sex offender risk assessments and treatment and supervision, but if it's not entertaining and fun for you, if you're not getting the needs that you have, it's useless. So feel free, please, to ask any questions that you have. We have people that are ready to run to you with a microphone, I guess. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and we got some runners that will come and bring the mic to you. I guess we need to have the mic for taping purposes and whatnot. So feel free, definitely, to chime in with any question that you might have. Am I missing anything? No? Okay. So the key points, in addition to the main takeaway question, or takeaway piece that we would like you to take home, we're going to talk about types of sex offenders and the rates of recidivism. Again, sex offender is not a sex offender is not a sex offender. So we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the differences, so you know what they might be when someone is being referred to your office, to your facility. And the rates of recidivism. Recidivism means rate of reoffense. How likely is a person to reoffend? We're going to talk about that a little bit, because it's not all the same. It's not all the same. Very different rates of reoffense for the different type of offender. So we're going to talk about that some more. And then what nursing home administrators and staff need to know about risk assessments. Obviously, you'll leave with a bit more of that. First, we're going to start off talking about some myths and facts about sex offenders. Question for everybody. Most sexual assaults are committed by strangers. False, false, true, false. I hear mostly false. False. The majority of sex offenses happen by an acquaintance to the victim or a family member to the victim. The vast majority. This graph helps show the age break. I guess I can use my pointer. The age break here on the bottom is the age of the victim. Red means family member, offender. Acquaintance is in blue, and then stranger, perpetrator, is in yellow. As you can see, the younger the age of the victim, the more likely it is going to be a family member perpetrator. As the victim increases in age, the more likely that it's going to be an acquaintance perpetrator. And then the stranger perpetrator is about the same, at about under 5-10% of the time, across the age range. So most sex offenses happen by someone that we know. It directly counters the widely held belief of the monster behind the bushes type of mentality for sex offenders. I'm not going to advocate for sex offenders, obviously, but I definitely want you to know the differences here. And so it definitely counters that belief that they are the monsters behind the... Is this working? There we go. There we go. Another question. Over half of sexual offenders will sexually reoffend. Over half. True, I hear falses. My PowerPoint didn't work quite well. That bottom thing was supposed to pop up next. It popped up first. I'm quite tech savvy. It's a very tricky question. And this is another piece that makes it very complicated, that there is a subset of sex offenders who reoffend at a rate over 50% at times. There's a subset of sex offenders who offend about 5% of the time. And so this is where it becomes very difficult when we start talking about sex offending, that some experts might go into court actually and say, well, the rate of sex offense is 10%. Well, what population are you talking about? Are you talking about intrafamilial sex offending? Intrafamilial is those offenders who offend within the family. Father, stepfather, for example, versus your exposers, your peepers. They offend at a much greater rate, reoffend at a much greater rate. And we'll talk about a little bit more of whys. But that's just kind of a quick introduction, again, to how different these sex offenders can be. The other piece, this slide is talking about, when we talk about reoffense, we have to talk about Is that sex offender reoffending in a sexual way or in a general way, in an other than sexual way? OWIs, assaults, domestics, which is an assault, theft is a reoffense of some kind. The majority of sex offenders, not all, majority of sex offenders we have found will reoffend in ways other than sexual offending. So if they pick up a sex offense in 1990, more likely to, if they're going to reoffend, pick up a burglary or pick up an assault or pick up something else if they're going to reoffend. So that's just interesting as well. So now let's start talking about the different types. We've given enough teasers about these different types of offenders. And this is the list of the general categories you can find the sex offenders lumped into. Some of these aren't, some of these might just be Tonyisms, like situational offender. You're not going to find that in the book, but situational offender. The generalist on the bottom, the second to the bottom. That's maybe more of our term for that. Before I get going, any questions about anything I mentioned so far? I just always want to stop and pause, see if there's any questions so far. Okay. We'll start talking about the situational offender. The situational offender is typically our lowest risk offender in our sex offender units. Situational offender typically have no to limited prior offenses. So they come to us and their sex offense is the only thing that they've ever had, juvenile and or adult, and the sex offense may be something where they were dating. They were 19, 20 years old, and they were dating or in a significant relationship, they thought, with maybe a 14-year-old. It was against the law, but it was consensual, in big quotes, consensual because the two parties weren't agreeing to it, but it was against the law. It was against the law. Or the other frequently seen scenario is people at parties. You get a 19-year-old at a party, lots of drugs, lots of alcohol, people have sex, and there's the age difference that makes it illegal. It was consensual, again, big quotes, I want to do that because it's against the law, and a minor cannot legally consent, which is the big quotes, but there's no force, violence, coercion, threats, violence. It was part of the party scene type of thing. So we do see some of those situations. And so when we have that situation, they typically show up as being low risk on all of our risk tools, which we'll talk about later, of what that risk assessment will look like. And we treat them differently than we do other offenders. We treat every offender, hopefully, if we're doing our job right, individually specific based on their needs and risk level. So this person gets this dosage of treatment that's appropriate for them and supervision. Intrafamilial. I introduced that term already. Again, within the family, intrafamilial offender. Interestingly enough, if the offender is not a pedophile, if we have identified that this person is not a pedophile, which is identified as somebody who's sexually aroused and interested in children under the age of 12, if that person is not a pedophile, the rate of reoffense for an offender who's offended within the family is 10% or lower. 10% of the time or lower, which is much different than the exposer, which I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's fitting. The exposer peeper, which can be up to 50, 60% of the time. So when we have 5 to 10%, it's a relatively lower number. Relatively lower number. Good. There we go. We're just going to have to mic you up. Sorry. It should work. He'll unmute you.
Why the age of 12?
Thank you. I could hear you, but I've been instructed to mic people up. Why the age of 12? Well, the age of 12 is the cut developed by the DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Psychological Conditions, Psychological Issues. And so pedophilia was identified as age of 12 or younger. We just have Carl Brack. I want to jump in real quick and introduce Carl Brack. Carl Brack is also part of this presentation. Carl Brack is a supervisor of the sex offender treatment program down in the 4th District. I want to get the 4th District, so the southern west corner of the state. And so Mr. Brack was kind enough to come and join us to be able to offer any alternatives or differences that he might see in his district. And he knows this stuff better than anybody, so he'll be able to chime in with this. You should get up here. All right. Any other questions? Thank you. That was a good question. Okay. Voyeurs and exposers, exhibitionists. So your peepers and exposers. I already gave it away that the rate of recidivism is quite high for exposers and peepers, from 40 to 70%, some studies found, 70%. Why is it so high? Because exposers and peepers, that behavior follows the same path as addiction, as substance abuse would follow. So for example, we'll liken it up to drug use. So we have an exposer who is very interested in going to the park and exposing. So there's a buildup of anticipation, similar to a drug user who's looking forward to the weekend. They can't wait to go meet up with their dealer and start partying for the weekend. That buildup of anticipation, similar in the brain. The chemistry is building up. It's similar chemistry in the brain. They're actually at the weekend now, and they're actually getting ready to do what they're going to do. The exposer is in the park, getting ready to do what they're doing. So more buildup of anticipation to actually do the behavior, similar to a substance abuser who has the drugs in front of them and getting ready to use. Many substance abuse users say that is almost more enjoyable and fun than actually using, is the anticipation of it. And then the actual use itself, the actual exposure, and then the the time afterwards of whatever it might be. Regret, shame, I can't believe I did it again, oh my gosh, I'm going to get caught, my partner finds out, yada, yada. All that is quite similar. So it follows the same behavioral pattern and the same chemistry pattern in the brain. Pretty interesting stuff. So when we have an exposer peeper on our caseload, they get a little bit different treatment. We're going to supervise them at a different level than we would the situational offender, for example, just because we know that addictive personality, and they might need additional therapeutic programming, treatment. Our next group, child molesters and rapists. Lump these two groups together because they also have very high rates of reoffense. So your pedophile, person who is attracted to children under the age of 12, and rapists. The rate of recidivism for rapists and children is outlined here. Green is your rapists, child molesters, in your red. It goes from 1 to 25-year follow-up in the study. Extensive study and follow-up. With about 1 year of time, there's about below 10% for both group, 10% recidivism for both group. But as you can tell, with this group, as they age and as they, get out of treatment or whatever it is, at 25 years, the rate for pedophiles, child molesters, is over 50% in some cases, if they're a pedophile. Rapists, a little bit lower. Because when we're dealing with a rapist, I don't know if that's the next slide. No, kind of. When we're dealing with a rapist, generally we're dealing with high antisocial personality, possible psychopathy, if they're a psychopath, and propensity for criminal activity, of which rape is one thing. That's what we've found. So the rape could be as likely as stealing your car, as assaulting you, because it's just an opportunity. It's a power and control thing. Much research has said, obviously. People know that literature, as well as just a general, all right, here's an opportunity. I'm going to steal your car, or I'm going to rape you. Child molesters and rapists, the reoffense types. So again, we talked about if they're going to reoffend, if sex offenders are going to reoffend, is it a sex offense? Is it a violent sex offense, or is it something else? We can see from here that the other recidivism, other types of crimes, on the far right here, rapists above 40%, that they're going to be involved in other types of crimes as well as sexual offending. So we need to identify them right up front. If this is a rape, if this is a rapist, and child molesters are about 35% of involving in other types of crimes, which is kind of surprising to me when I saw that, and I don't really have a good reasoning for why child molesters might have other types of crime. I just don't know. So that'd be something I need to figure out. Any questions on this? Rapists, pedophiles, child molesters. This is what the society and media usually portrays as a sex offender, so I again want to stress this is the lowest number of offenders we have in our units. We have maybe 300 offenders now, Christine, do you think, in our unit? In the 5th District, 250, 300? Yeah, 250, 300 offenders, and we might have less than 10 pedophiles, much less than 10 pedophiles, and then rapists, probably about the same number. The large majority is our intrafamilial offender. Yeah.
What's the oldest person? I mean, is there a certain age that it tends to die off or whatever?
Okay, good question. So there's 2 questions there. Our oldest person in our unit, 80s? 81? Recently, yep, recently 81. With kind of what I'm hearing from the question is, does age have some kind of effect of recidivism, is what I took from that. Yes, age has been found recently, within the last 5 or so years. Age is a protective factor for sex offenders, which means that the older they get, to a certain point, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the less likely they're going to reoffend. In most cases. Not all cases, because this 81-year-old, I think he never had a prior charge at all, and so he's an anomaly. But most of the time, with age comes reduced recidivism. Very good to know for this population, for this group. Good question. And this is kind of a backwards flipped slide, talking about the percentage of sex offenders who have not recidivated. Not recidivated. So the top line, yellow, it's kind of probably hard to see back there, it's bright. Your incest offenders have the lowest rate of reoffense. Why? Why might that be? Because what we've found, believe, is that if they're not a pedophile, again, take that subgroup out, is once they have been identified within the family, the protective factors by the family automatically go into place. I'm not going to let Uncle Johnny did this. I'm not going to let my son, daughter, niece, nephew be around Uncle Johnny unsupervised. So the natural family protective pieces come into play then when someone has been identified like that. And if they're not a pedophile, then that urge is not there. There's some other reason for them to sexually offend against that person, other than pedophilia. Generalists. We talked about this a little bit with your rapists. Again, this isn't going to be a term you're going to see in the books, but our generalist is somebody who is very high risk. They have a lengthy criminal history. It's a variety of crimes. It could stem back to juvenile, doesn't have to, but generally it does, some juvenile acting out, conduct disorder stuff. And typically antisocial personality disorder has been a diagnosis given to them. If not, they would fit that by us. We'll do the evaluation. We'll talk a bit more about what that means. Psychopathy, We would then rule out psychopathy for that person. That's a different evaluation to see if they're a psychopath. Different treatment for a psychopath. Intense supervision and tracking required. Christine and Carl as well could talk about the differences of techniques, things we do to beef up the level of supervision for our higher risk offenders, since you're not mic'd up. The increased office visits. We have GPS tracking. All sex offenders will go on GPS tracking for a time. Our generalists, our high-risk offenders may be on GPS tracking for a long time. A long time. Home visits. We'll do home visits frequently, just to keep continual tabs and eyes on that person in a variety of ways, in group, in individual PO meetings, probation officer meetings, home visits, variety of settings. Female offenders. We have some female offenders. The numbers are quite low. How many female offenders do we have now? Less than 5? 6 or 7 now? Okay, wow. 6 or 7 female sex offenders out of our 250, 300. That's about right. That's pretty consistent with, since I've been with the unit, 2007. The rate of reoffense, well, let's start here. Between 14 and 24% of sexually abused males and 6 to 14% of sexually abused females report that the abuser was a female. So less than 20% mostly of victims have been abused by a female. The dynamics of female sex abuse is much different than males. We're dealing with much different issues than when we're dealing with males, when we're working with males. With females, we're also dealing with a lot of trauma and a lot of abuse that they've experienced co-occurring with their sex offending. So 60 to 100% of sexually abused or perpetrators, female perpetrators, were also sexually abused. 50 to almost 100% physically abused as youth. So we're dealing with a lot of trauma that these women have experienced, which is not always the case with men. About some stats say 30 to 60% of men have been sexually abused, perpetrators. So it's not as pronounced as and profound as with female offenders. Most victims are relatives and acquaintances, with females as well, with nearly 50% being acquaintance. 33% abuse their own children, which is kind of an odd thing, that when someone abuses their own child, we look at that a little bit differently than when it's an outside the family member, a niece, a nephew, something else, non-blood, because there's something of the taboo factor that I wouldn't do that to my own flesh and blood. I'll do it to my stepdaughter, stepson, but not my own flesh and blood. So when there's offense against their own child, something else is going on here. Our ears really get perked when that happens, in just a different way. Our ears get perked with a lot of different things, but it's just a different dynamic going on. 9% stranger victims. So again, confronts that notion of monster behind the bushes type of thing. The interesting piece is another interesting piece. 75% of female offenders commit offenses with a co-defendant, a co-offender. They're in a relationship. So that woman is in a relationship. And majority of the times, that male wants to have, some kind of contact with the woman's child. And so that offender will coerce, threaten, whatever, to have some kind of contact with the mother and the child. And so the mother, for some reason, dependency, fear, goes along with it, is a participant of that. So we see that quite, as much as percentages of having female offenders. We're going to talk next about the different female types of offenders. The teacher lover, This is where there's a relationship between the two. This is your stereotypical high school female teacher having a relationship with sexual relationship with a student. There's actually a relationship in their minds. It's illegal, it's totally wrong, unethical, but there's a relationship in their minds. Intergenerationally disposed type of offender, where that woman has been a history of her own physical and sexual abuse, and, well, it was done to me, it's what I'm going to do. This is what I know, this is what I'm going to do, type of thing. And the male coerced, we've already talked about that, where they are involved in a relationship and either they're going along out of fear. If I don't do this, he's going to kill me. He's going to kill my daughter. Oh my gosh, forget it. Or I don't want to leave this guy. This guy means the world to me. I'm not going to leave him. I don't want him to abandon us. So, okay. Risk for reoffense. The risk for female reoffense is very, very low. Very, very low. Less than 5%. Some stats even say 1%. Less than 5% of females will sexually reoffend. It's a kind of an eye-opening number. And they'll most likely reoffend with non-sexual crimes. Theft, prostitution, something like that. We found. That's a natural stopping point for that. Any questions on the different types of offenders, the recidivism rates for those offenders? Is this helpful so far? Is this new information at least? Okay. Because when I talk to different crowds, some of this is totally foreign. So I want to make sure that at least it's something new for you guys to take home. Anything you guys would add in, Christine or Carl, of types of offenders or recidivism rates or anything that I missed out or you think would be valuable? No? Got to mic you up, Carl, sorry.
Female offenders we've had are what you talked about, in a relationship with someone else and coerced by the male to reoffend.
Okay, so despite the different districts, it's very similar population and dynamics playing out. Okay, that's good to know.
And there, you were asking earlier about age. We had to send a gentleman who was 82 years old to prison, and then he just got out. He actually made it, which we weren't sure he would, and he's back on supervision with us again. And some of the elderly gentlemen that we've had, although they're less likely to offend as they got older, it contributed to their offense because of the sexual dysfunction, and they were too embarrassed to try anything with their spouse, whoever they were with, so they thought they could try and experiment sexually with a child to see if they were able to get aroused because they weren't as embarrassed around a child.
Thank you. Anything, Christine, you might add I missed or? Nope, okay, thank you. All right. Switching gears to talking about risk assessments. What you guys need to know, should know, about risk assessments. If you guys are looking at bringing in a sex offender, a past sex offender, into your agency, what do you need to know about the risk assessment? Hopefully I'll answer that here. If not, definitely ask questions. Things we're going to be talking about: risk classification and process for identifying risk. This was part of what was on my slab to talk about risk classification. I think Cheryl Nolan might do a better job of talking about the tiers, the registry tiers, because that's different than maybe how we would identify risk groupings. And so we are going to be talking about how we identify different categories of risk in the evaluation versus the tier levels. So how the Division of Criminal Investigation might identify a tier. When do you do and update a risk assessment? We're going to be talking about that. Who does the risk assessments? Can I and how can I access existing risk assessments from other people? And then the last one, how do I use this information? Hopefully we can maybe have a discussion about that. I'm not going to help write policy, obviously, right now, but at least we can answer some questions that might drive you and your committees to do that. This slide, you're not going to be able to read everything. It's quite small, kind of on purpose. putting everything on there of what goes into a psychosexual risk assessment. That's what they're called, psychosexual risk assessment. They're pretty complex, thorough evaluations. We have a variety of different things that go into them. Part of the interview, a forensic interview, all these different components of the interview are addressed. We have actuarial risk assessment tools. Actuarial risk assessment tools are like what you would see with your insurance. So the insurance companies, taking it away from here to maybe makes more sense, the insurance company knows by using stats, research, that a 16-year-old boy has a higher rate of accidents than a 15-year-old male. Different factors. So that rate of premium goes up for a 16-year-old male versus a 50-year-old male. This is similar. That what sex offender experts and researchers did is identify what factors increase the rate of recidivism for a sex offender. And those factors are what's in these tools. That if John Doe offender has these factors, their rate of reoffense is at this category. If they only have 2, it's in this category. If they have 0, it's in this category. Similar to insurance. So we have a number of those tools at our disposal to help identify sex offender-specific risk. The other tools over here, PPG and affinity, these are physiological tests of arousal. So they look at your internal physiology to look at what you're aroused to. We don't have time to go into all the specifics of what those are. I guess we might. It's 9. Yeah, if you guys, physiological tests of arousal. We have some general types of tests. LSI, level of service inventory, and Iowa risk. They look at general risk. Because not only are we looking at sex offender risk, but we want to know the generalist piece. Again, we talked about that earlier on an earlier slide of the generalist. We want to know, with those sex offender pieces, what's the likelihood they're going to be the recidivism for sex offending. But then these other tests, what's the likelihood they're going to offend in a different way? Assault, theft, drugs. So these other tests help us identify that. Because sometimes the sex offense piece might be quite low. Somehow those sex offender risk tools are rather low, but their general risk is very high. Very high risk generally. So that would tell us that not only are they high risk, but sex offense might be one of many things that they might do. For some reason, they were low on the static, for example, but their LSI is quite high. So it's a combination of tools and experience and knowledge of the research to kind of map these things together to make sense of it for the reader, for you, when you're making those decisions, for the treatment team and probation team when they're making decisions on supervision and treatment. I want to go through all this stuff. Just kind of a slide saying how comprehensive it is. In a nutshell, what are the big risk factors, primary risk factors for sex offending? Age was already brought up nicely. History of intimate relationships. Do they have a history of maintaining healthy, intimate relationships for a number of years? If not, that's a problem. If they can, that's a support. History of non-sexual violence. Is there a history of other types of assaults, abuse, other than sex? Risk factor. Non-contact sex offenses. Voyeurism, peepers. Prior sex offenses, obviously. I mean, if past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior, if they've engaged in a sex crime before, the odds go up. Criminal history in general, again, they're generalist. Gender of the victim is actually one that's not attached to the offender. If they offend against males, specifically male minors, their risk really goes up versus male females. And was the victim related to the offender or a stranger? So this is tapping into that idea of, was it an intrafamilial, you guys know these terms now, intrafamilial offender inside the family, or was it a stranger outside the family? They didn't know, the offender didn't know the victim. If they did not know the victim, the risk really goes up for that person. So you can kind of visualize a person who's hitting these pieces, their risk of reoffense really goes up. So when do you do or update a risk assessment? We do an assessment within the first couple months that they're on supervision with us. We want to get the most thorough, accurate picture of this person's risk and needs from the very, very beginning, so we can offer person-specific treatment. We update those assessments in a variety of different ways. We update those assessments through our general risk tools. Our LSI is updated every year. The other tools are updated every 6 months. The sex offender-specific tools, like the Stable 2000, you're not supposed to remember that, but or probably won't remember that, but the Stable 2000 will be updated every 6 months or so. So we get a continual relook at how this person is doing and their level of risk. For you guys, let's go back to that slide. Thank you. Unless they're being referred from the Department of Corrections and have a current updated psychosexual risk assessment completed from which they were working from, care facilities should administer or request an updated risk assessment. If they're coming from the prison, they have a lot of information. I don't know if they are able, just for funding and resources of conducting a psychosexual evaluation the way we might, just because they got really hit hard with budget crunches. But they know a lot of information about that offender, obviously. If that offender is coming from Mount Pleasant is the sex offender treatment facility in Iowa. If they're coming from Mount Pleasant, those counselors know a lot. Talk to the reentry specialist or their counselor. So these are buzzwords, keywords for you to know who you're calling. Talk to that person, and they can give you information with a release. They want to get out of prison. They wanted to transfer somewhere. So I would not anticipate the release would be hard to get. They want to go somewhere. So and the prison is motivated to discharge them as well when that time comes. Who can do these risk assessments? The evaluator must be specifically trained and have knowledge in sex offender evaluations, treatment, and supervision. I have psychosexual risk assessment up there italicized because it's very important, in my eyes, very important that the evaluator have this specific knowledge. It might be easier for this crowd to go to their local psychologist to do an evaluation. That psychologist might be very knowledgeable, very trained in doing psychological evaluations. But as you can see from that past slide of how comprehensive and different these assessments are, that generalist, that general psychologist, as good as they are in what they do, this is a specialty. This is a specialty area that has special training and expertise to it. So we need to have someone with that level of expertise doing these evaluations to provide you with the most correct information. I've seen evaluations that they did an interview and an MMPI and said the person is low risk. We do an evaluation, we dig into all the other pieces that weren't hit, just no fraud on the other person's part, they just did not know. They did not know the intricacies of this. We do the evaluation, we say, oh my gosh, this person is high risk because of this. Prior victims, the gender of the victim, the impulsivity pieces, the past crimes, yada, 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 which aren't captured by the MMPI or a general mental health eval. So, strongly recommend a specialist. Where you can go to find someone in your area, we have 2 web pages here that could direct you somewhere, direct you to a provider. IBSTA, the Iowa Board for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, is a state of Iowa organization that provides training, consultation around sex offender issues. There are certified people in your area. Going to this webpage should at least get you in that direction for someone to call. ATSA, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, is the national organization. their providers on that list as well. Any questions on that? Yes. Oh, need a mic.
How accurate are those risk assessments if you're doing them?
I believe they are very accurate. They are very accurate. We feel, and Carl and Christine chime in, with the comprehensiveness of these evaluations, with the evaluation, with the physiological piece included, as well as the polygraph in there. We didn't talk about the polygraph as part of that component, but it's included to get a full psychosexual evaluation. We feel very confident and comfortable in knowing, is this person a low-risk offender? Is it a kind of a medium-risk offender, or are they high risk? Beyond that, we might be splitting hairs if they're moderate high or moderate low. I feel pretty good that we can be able to identify the low, moderate, and high through that process.
And are you doing a risk assessment on all quote-unquote sexual offenders as they leave the system?
As they leave the system, our evaluation, that full evaluation that we're talking about, is done up front. And then the updates occur throughout. So when the time that they leave, they have the updates completed. But the full psychosexual would not be redone. But the updates that pertain to their general risk and their sex offender's risk would be. Polygraph results would be up to date at that point. So we have a pretty good picture of that person as they're leaving.
And final question. As somebody wants to enter, say, a facility that is maybe a registered sex offender, how quickly can they get that information from you as far as the risk assessment goes?
That's a good question. That may actually go to Christine, because she's our reentry specialist that deals with a lot of this. Do you think you can want Carl or Christine?
I would say it would depend if
Oop,
they
sorry.
I would say it greatly depends on whether they're coming from an institution to one of the facilities and that they've done sex offender treatment in the institution, or if they're coming to the facility from community-based corrections and have done sex offender treatment with us. If they've been involved in the sex offender treatment process on community-based corrections, we would have that information readily available. If they're coming from the institution, that information has not even been readily available to ourselves, and there's a process of obtaining that. So I couldn't answer the speed, and it depends on the institution as well. I mean, do you have anything?
Going back to your original question too on how comfortable are we with the risk assessments? The risk assessments Dr. Tatman was showing you included both static and dynamic risk assessments. So an offender comes to us, they're immediately, within the first week, given a static risk assessment, factors that aren't changing, their age, who they offended against, things of that nature. So we get a general idea right from the get-go. After they've been in our program for 1 to 3 months, and they're administered a polygraph, and we can obtain some more in-depth information on their sexual preoccupation, their sexual history, we're able to administer the stable, which is a dynamic risk assessment, which at any given moment in that person's life may change depending on where they're at. So between the static and the dynamic risk assessments and a polygraph, after 3 months, we feel we have a very good handle on where the risk of that individual, and these risk assessments have been validated several times over also. As far as how long it takes, I say within the first week they're given one, and then we don't, and we get into this argument with the county attorney's office several times. They are always wanting more information. They'll want to use our risk assessments during the course of, say, a pre-sentence investigation before they're deciding whether to send someone to prison or remain in the community. And we keep telling them these risk assessments that are dynamic are not, it's not a tool that we use to identify community risk right from the get-go because we just don't know. So we're very careful about when we administer them and all the information that we gather. So in our program, after about the first 3 months, we've got a pretty good picture of where they're at.
Thank you. Yeah, going back to this, that one. Oops. This one. The 3 months, that's similar with the 5th district. About 3 months, we have a pretty good look with their risk, at their risk. The piece that really, the polygraph and the conduct or behavior in group treatment or supervision is one piece that, to kind of follow up on what we're talking about of, we just don't know when they enter the door, when they walk through the door, we just don't know yet. It takes time to get through some of the honeymoon period and to get to know that person through the interview and then to see real behavior coming out. So a couple months, that honeymoon period starts to go down, the true colors start to come out, and we get to see real reactions to adversity. Adversity meaning they ask their probation officer if they can do X, Y, Z, and the probation officer's, no, I don't think so. How do they respond to that? That's very telling. How do they respond to their peers in group? How do they respond to a variety of things? So behavior in group and conduct in group is very important for us to know as well to feed into that psychosexual evaluation.
How do they get off the program, or they're no longer being treated by you guys? Or I'm not sure if Cheryl was going to address this in the next session, but you know, you guys have done the program with them, and you've done their outtake assessment, if you will, and they're in the community, and then they show up at the nursing facility maybe 10, 15 years later, or even 20 years, 30 years, 50 years later. How do we know if they're not going to become problematic again, especially when you add the diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's, or even other comorbidities that may affect them? And so how does that process all work? Can we call you guys and say, hey, listen, we're going to be taking this gentleman or female. They were on the registry years ago. Can you do another assessment for us? Or what would be the process, or how would that work?
Unfortunately, if they are not on supervision or in probation or parole, I don't think we as the Department of Correctional Services would be able to provide that evaluation because they're not under our watch, and for a variety of different reasons we wouldn't be able to do that. So it would be a private provider out there. And so what I would encourage the care facilities in this room to do is to use those numbers and contact a local provider and email me at the end. Our emails are at the end. Feel free to email or call or reach out to us, and we'll find providers or help find providers in your area. Because we want to help you. We have invested interest as well for placement of folks in your facilities if it's appropriate. And so that evaluation I would encourage that evaluation to be redone so you guys have up-to-date current information, because it could be 20, 30 years old. So that person has had different kind of following up with what Carl was talking about with dynamic risk. The dynamic risk piece. Their life has changed. Their situation is different than it was 20 years ago. How is it different? That's the evaluator's job, is to figure out how is that different, what's going on with that person right now, today, to give you the most up-to-date information.
And could you tell us how costly those assessments are, and would it be something a facility should ask a potential resident to cover that cost, or their family, or is it covered by insurance? Any ideas?
Hitting the last question first, covered by insurance, typically not. It's not seen as a medically necessary evaluation unless somehow it can be framed that way to the insurance provider. But that's the key phrase, is that it's a medically necessary service. Who pays? Second question. Who pays? I don't know. That's a good question. That's a good one. And how much? It can vary. It can vary. To kind of tie them together, that whole assessment is very costly for us. I mean, it's a time investment. The tools are generally not a lot of money. The static is paper, pencil, we know that, we can do that. MMPIs are pretty cheap, but the time investment to do something like that is extensive. So we just, private providers kind of range from $500 to a couple $1,000s. Is that about right in your area too? Is that, so,
Great, thanks.
okay, yeah. Yeah.
Just the added note on that is that we do have individuals in our program now who are sentenced to lifetime supervision, so they are on lifetime parole, and then there's other individuals who are on lifetime registry. So a couple of examples of that when Dr. Tatman spoke of specifically the dating relationships. We have some individuals now, at least a couple I can speak of, who were, a 19 or 20-year-old offender. The victim was 13 or 14 years old. An illegal relationship, however consensual. Someone, they ended up getting charged with that and convicted, and those individuals are on lifetime supervision. So being that they're in their 20s now, years from now as they're aging, may be becoming individuals needing nursing home or residential services. We also have many others as far as that are the aging population now, and then the other population that I specifically supervise is brain injured, low functioning, ID, sex offenders who many are currently in group homes or nursing home facilities. And we are seeing more of that need as more and more individuals are being released from the institutions. So that's specifically where I'm focused.
You were asking about how long to get out of the program or what they have to do. I can tell you in all the districts that I know of, nobody has to jump through more hoops than offenders in the sex offender treatment program. So if, Joe offender goes and steals a car, he's on probation for 2 years. Once a month, he pops into his probation officer's office and they verify he's doing what he's supposed to do, pays everything, and he's done after 2 years. Sex offender in our program, they're going to be required to, for 2 years, go to group therapy once a week. They're required to take polygraph examinations. They're going to be supervised in the community at the highest level of supervision and wear the GPS bracelet. And then they're going to be placed in an aftercare program after that 2 years. So if you were to come across an individual who has successfully gone through a treatment program, they've had to do more and meet more expectations than any other offenders that the Department of Corrections has in the community.
Yep, good point.
And could I clarify when you said if they're still involved in the correction system, then you would be able to give an updated assessment? So if someone is on a lifetime supervision or probation, then you would be able to give an updated
Correct.
assessment?
Happily.
The release of information, but like Tony said, when they're wanting, with the release of information, but like Dr. Tatman said, when they're wanting to be admitted into a facility, they're willing to sign those releases so the information can be shared.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that's a good point with the lifetime supervision. More and more folks are still going to be under our watch that will be referred, possibly applicants for your programs. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Did I answer both? Did we answer both of those questions enough? Okay. I know we went around quick. All right. How can we access? We've already hit on this. We've already talked about that. I'm just getting a release. Contacting the agency where they last fell from, So for example, if they're coming from Mount Pleasant or some prison, talking to those counselors and reentry coordinators. If they're on supervision with a lifetime supervision or they were with probation, then contacting that district and that unit, sex offender unit, and they, with the release, will be able to give what was last done and work with you. At least tell you what bin they were in, low, medium, or high risk type of bin that offender might be in at that time. How do I use this information? Making placement decisions. So our last piece for the day, with that evaluation, with all the information you've gotten so far, hopefully you leave here knowing that a sex offender is not a sex offender is not a sex offender. There's low-risk sex offenders, and that, following with Carl's piece, that they've gone through supervision with the district and have successfully completed that without revocation, major violations as they leave the program. That person has gone through some major hoops. They've done a very good job. We keep very close eyes. So talking with that district to know how did they do on your supervision. And so placement decisions, with that evaluation, you'll be able to know potential issues around roommates, okay? You'll know more dynamics around that person's crime, sexual preferences, crime types, to know, is there a roommate type that might be potentially a victim to that person or at risk. Again, with the age is a very protective factor. I don't want to not stress that enough, that I've said it enough. Risk to visitors with the evaluation, and work with that evaluator, possibly with the district if we're still involved, of how can we put a safety plan in place with your guys' collaboration to make sure that when minors come in as visitors, everybody is safe, that the nursing staff might be safe if it's a type of expose or peeper type of situation. So a collaboration with the evaluator, with the district, and your staff to know how do we best protect the visitors. Point blank, is this person appropriate? Can they be appropriately supervised in your facility? Yes or no? I mean, there's a lot of discussion around that with a particular person based on all the information. Whether additional safety precautions are needed when assisting in ADLs, that'd be good to know. If the person has to have special requirements, special situations in place to do that. Does the potential resident need additional sex offender treatment? Maybe. Maybe as this 81-year-old enters our program, he might be in a care facility in 2 years. He's not done with our program, maybe. How do we negotiate treatment at the same time he's in your facility? And is that appropriate? So some of those discussions. So the evaluation will hopefully, and the collaboration, hopefully will allow those decisions to be made, at least the discussions to happen. So I don't know how, yeah. Anything I missed, Carl or Christine?
No, I think people want definitive answers, but especially with sex offenders, we're dealing with human behavior, so a risk assessment, we can't say, oh, this guy's score is here, you're fine, take him in your facility, he's not going to reoffend. We just don't know. That's why we have a multitude of tools that we use. And they're tools, but we just can't predict human behavior. And people get very nervous when it comes to sex offenders because they want assurances, and unfortunately, we just can't give any.
Yep, good point. Good point. Anything else, Christine, I missed, or, okay. Any questions that have not been answered from anybody? Yeah.
So what do you do with if you have an elderly sex offender who is incarcerated, so they're in prison, and they have a stroke, and so that leaves them not able to do anything with their left side or right side or whatever that may be. So they need nursing home care. So do they remain in the system? Do they, what do you do? I'm sure that happens, so what happens to those folks?
Let Christine take that one. Perfect. Or Carl.
That's a huge problem at the moment for the Department of Corrections. You know, we recently converted a residential facility that was designated for female offenders just for sex offenders now. We're the only ones that do that. They all have to start there no matter what, right on the street. Well, what we're coming to find is, as well, the people that have jobs and are doing what they're supposed to do and are able to live independently in the community, they get out in a reasonable time fashion. The elderly, the disabled, the people that need levels of care that almost exceed what we have to offer, we don't have anywhere to put them. And the prisons and the institutions, the districts really struggle with offenders that need higher levels of care. It's a big problem.
And their level of risk may not be dictating them being at your facility or our facility, our Fort Des Moines. It's their other needs. Yep, the other needs that are dictating that they can't find an apartment or a residence of their own. It's not dictated by risk.
Doctor, does somebody, once they're on a sex offender registry, do they ever come off? Is there a time frame where if they don't recommit a crime, sexual or otherwise, do they come off at a certain time period?
10 or life, or 10 years or life in Iowa. Different states are different. Iowa is 10 years or life.
Can a sex offender be court-ordered to a facility without the facility's permission?
Ooh.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Technically, no. You know, they think that they can, and there have been people that are ordered to facilities, but a lot of people don't realize or know, so don't tell anybody. But if the facility doesn't want to take that person, they don't have to. But because placement is, I mean, I've sent one to Christine here recently in some other districts. Everybody has extremely difficult cases to work with, so everybody tries to help everybody else out because everybody always gets stuck in a situation where you have no place. You know, we have a couple individuals in prison right now that were, you know, threatened to rape my psychologist and were assaultive, and nowhere else in the state will take him, and he's from our district, and we have no idea what to do with him. Can't afford to live on his own, has no family support, but he threatened to hurt the staff that are currently there again. So there's always cases like that.